My husband texted me that he was working late, but at that exact moment, she was sitting 2 tables away watching him laugh with another woman like nothing in his life had ever been more amusing. Margaret Hayes didn't move when the message lit up her phone screen, her thumb resting lightly against the glass as if even the smallest reaction might disturb something fragile and invisible in the air. The kind of moment that only holds together if you don't touch it too quickly. And across the restaurant, under warm amber lighting that softened everything except the truth, Daniel Hayes leaned back in his chair, relaxed, confident, his hand resting casually near a half-finished glass of red wine while Olivia Carter said something that made him smile in a way Margaret hadn't seen directed at her in months, maybe longer, and, for a second, her mind did what minds do when reality arrives too fast. It tried to adjust the picture, to rename it, to soften it into something reasonable like business, like coincidence, like timing that just looked worse than it was. But then Olivia reached across the table and touched his wrist, not briefly, not by accident, and Daniel didn't pull away. He didn't even hesitate. He just let it happen as if it belonged there, as if it had always belonged there, and Margaret felt something inside her go completely still, not broken, not shattered, just quiet. Like a room after the door has been closed and everyone has left without saying goodbye. The restaurant around her continued in its usual rhythm, silverware against plates, low conversations blending into a steady hum. A waiter passing by with a tray that smelled faintly of butter and garlic. And none of it stopped, none of it shifted, because nothing in the world had actually changed. Only her understanding of it had, and that difference was everything. She lowered her phone slowly to the table, screen still glowing with Daniel's message, "Don't wait up." And she almost smiled at the precision of it, because technically, he wasn't lying. He just wasn't where he said he was, and that distinction mattered more than it should have. She studied him then, not like a wife looking at her husband, but like someone observing a stranger in a public place, noting details, the way his shoulders leaned slightly forward when he was interested, the small nod he gave when Olivia spoke, the familiarity in his posture, and most of all, the absence of caution. Because if this were new, if this were uncertain, there would have been glances around the room, a careful distance, something to suggest risk, but there was none of that, only ease, only certainty. And that was when Margaret understood that this hadn't started tonight. Whatever this was had history, had repetition, had time to become comfortable, and that realization settled deeper than anything else. She reached for her water glass and took a small sip, the coolness grounding her, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, because reacting would have been easy, standing up, walking across those few feet, forcing the moment into something loud and undeniable. But easy wasn't what she needed right now, not when something about this felt larger than a simple betrayal, something in the way Daniel carried himself, in the timing, in the quiet confidence of it, suggested that there was more beneath the surface, something she hadn't seen yet. And across the room, Olivia leaned in slightly, her voice too low to hear, Daniel's smile widening just a fraction, and then it happened. Subtle enough that most people wouldn't have noticed, but Margaret did, because she was watching for it now. He reached across the table and took Olivia's hand, not quickly, not nervously, but slowly, deliberately, his fingers closing around hers as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And for a brief moment, everything else faded, the sound, the light, the movement, all of it pulling back until there was only that single point of contact. And Margaret didn't react. She didn't move. She just watched. Because in that instant, she knew something important, something that would matter later, something that Daniel clearly hadn't considered at all. He thought this moment belonged only to him, but it didn't, not anymore, not now that she had seen it, and that was his first mistake. Margaret did not pull her gaze away from their table, but she did shift her attention, not to escape what she had just seen, but to understand it more clearly. Because there was something in the way Daniel held Olivia's hand that did not match a careless mistake or a moment of weakness. It was too practiced, too certain, and certainty always came from repetition. She placed her phone face down on the table, the message still unread in her notifications, as if leaving it untouched might preserve the illusion he had tried to create, and for a few seconds she allowed herself to breathe slowly, evenly. The way she had learned to do in situations where reacting too quickly would cost more than it solved. The restaurant continued around her, a couple at the next table discussing vacation plans in low voices, a server refilling water glasses with quiet efficiency, the faint sound of ice settling in a drink somewhere behind her, everything normal, everything steady, and that normalcy only sharpened the contrast of what was unfolding 2 tables ahead. Daniel leaned closer now, his voice low. His posture relaxed in a way that suggested he did not expect to be interrupted. Not tonight, not here, and that detail settled into Margaret's mind with quiet precision, because people who believed they were safe behaved differently from those who knew they were being watched, and Daniel looked like a man who had calculated his surroundings and found no risk in them. Olivia said something that made him laugh again, softer this time, and she tilted her head slightly, her fingers still resting in his as if the contact had become part of the conversation itself. Not a gesture, not a signal, just something that belonged there, and Margaret noticed the way Olivia's thumb moved once, lightly, almost absent-mindedly. A small motion that carried more familiarity than any word could. This was not new, not accidental, not something that had just begun. It had rhythm, timing, ease, and that meant it had history. Margaret reached for her water again, but did not drink, her fingers resting against the glass as she watched Daniel reach into the inside pocket of his jacket, the movement subtle but deliberate. He pulled out a thick envelope, the kind used for documents, not letters, and placed it on the table between them. Olivia's expression did not change in surprise or confusion. She simply glanced at it, then back at him, then reached into her own bag and produced a folder, slim, structured, professional, and for a moment the air around Margaret seemed to shift, not emotionally, but logically. Because this no longer fit inside the shape of an affair. Affairs were careless, impulsive, built on secrecy and emotion, but this looked organized, intentional, planned. Daniel slid the envelope toward Olivia. She opened it just enough to look inside, not fully, just a quick confirmation, then gave a small nod, the kind people give when something matches expectations. And in return she pushed the folder toward him. He did not open it immediately. He only rested his hand on top of it, his expression thoughtful, measured, like a man reviewing a deal rather than enjoying a dinner, and that was when Margaret felt the first real shift inside her, not anger, not even betrayal, but clarity, the kind that arrives quietly and rearranges everything without asking permission, because whatever was happening at that table was not limited to a personal betrayal. It carried structure, intent, and purpose. She leaned back slightly in her chair, adjusting her view without drawing attention, and that was when she noticed the man seated at the table beside hers. He had been there the entire time, mid-60s perhaps, gray hair. A glass of bourbon in front of him that he had barely touched, his gaze fixed in the same direction as hers, not openly staring, but observing with a focus that did not belong to casual curiosity, and as if sensing the shift in her attention. He spoke without turning his head, his voice low and steady. "You see it too," he said, not as a question, but as confirmation. Margaret did not answer right away, her eyes still on Daniel as he finally opened the folder and glanced through its contents. With the same calm confidence he had shown all evening, then she spoke, just enough for him to hear. "Yes," she said quietly, and the man gave a small nod, as if that was all he needed. "Then do not go over there," he added, his tone unchanged. "Not yet." Margaret felt the words subtle, not as advice, but as instruction shaped by experience, and for the first time since she had walked into the restaurant, she understood that she was not the only one who had been watching this unfold, and more importantly, she was not the only one who already knew that this was not just about a husband holding another woman's hand. It was about something else entirely, something Daniel clearly believed he controlled, and that belief, Margaret realized, was going to matter very soon. The man did not look at her when he spoke again, which made his presence feel even more deliberate, as if he had learned long ago that direct eye contact could break moments that needed to stay intact. "My name is Richard Cole," he said quietly, his fingers resting near his untouched glass, "and the woman sitting across from your husband is my wife." Margaret let that settle without turning her head, her gaze still fixed forward. Because looking at him now would make this conversation real in a way that might force a reaction, and she was not ready to react, not when there was still too much she did not understand. "How long have you known?" she asked after a moment, her voice steady, controlled, and Richard gave a faint exhale that could have been a laugh if it carried any warmth. "Long enough to stop guessing and start confirming," he said. "About a week." "A week," Margaret repeated silently, aligning that with the past few months, the late meetings, the subtle shifts, the small changes she had noticed, but not named, and suddenly those pieces began to form something more structured, something less like coincidence and more like intention. Across the room, Daniel closed the folder and slipped it into his jacket with the same calm precision he had used when taking Olivia's hand. Then he lifted his glass and took a slow sip, as if concluding a conversation that had gone exactly as planned. Olivia mirrored the gesture, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, not emotional, not conflicted, just certain, and that certainty echoed what Margaret had already begun to understand. This was not a secret being discovered. It was a process already in motion. "They have done this before," Richard continued, his voice low enough that it blended into the background noise. "Not here, not always together, but enough that patterns start to show." Margaret absorbed that without visible reaction, because patterns meant planning, and planning meant purpose. And purpose meant this extended beyond personal betrayal into something more deliberate, something that involved decisions made over time. "What kind of patterns?" she asked, and Richard shifted slightly in his seat, finally turning just enough that she could see the edge of his profile. "Meetings that look like business," he said, "locations that change but stay consistent in type, restaurants like this, hotel lounges, places where no one asks questions if two people sit across from each other for an hour." Margaret glanced briefly at the table again, at the empty envelope now resting beside Olivia's plate, at the absence of surprise in either of their expressions, and then back to her own glass, her fingers still resting against it without lifting it. "And the documents," she said, not as a question, and Richard nodded. "That is new," he replied, "or at least new to me." A pause followed, not uncomfortable, but weighted, as if both of them were reaching the same conclusion from different directions, and then he added, "I hired someone." Margaret did not turn, but she listened more closely. "Private investigator," he continued. "I wanted to be certain before I did anything, because once you act, you cannot take it back." Margaret felt a small shift in her understanding again, not emotional, but strategic, because this man had not come here by accident. He had not simply walked in and discovered something unexpected. He had been watching, preparing, gathering information, and now he was here at the exact moment something changed. "What did you find?" she asked quietly, and Richard took a slow breath before answering. "Enough to know this is not just about them," he said. "There are transfers, meetings with lawyers, documents filed under different names, nothing illegal on the surface, but not random either." Margaret's mind moved through that carefully, connecting it to Daniel's recent behavior, the conversations that had ended abruptly when she entered the room, the financial decisions he had framed as routine, the way he had started separating things that had always been shared, and suddenly the envelope on the table felt heavier than it looked. "So this is planned," she said. And Richard gave a small nod. "Yes," he replied, "and whatever they are planning, they think no one else sees it yet." Margaret allowed herself one brief glance toward Daniel again, just enough to confirm what she already knew. He looked completely at ease, completely in control, like a man who believed he was steps ahead of everyone else in the room, and for the first time since she had sat down, something close to understanding settled fully into place. Not anger, not even betrayal. But clarity sharpened by timing, because if Richard was right, then tonight was not the beginning of anything, it was the middle of something already set in motion, and Daniel had no idea that the moment he reached for Olivia's hand had changed the equation entirely, not because of what it meant, but because of who had seen it, and that difference, Margaret realized, was going to matter more than anything he had planned. Margaret did not respond immediately after Richard finished speaking, not because she lacked an answer, but because she understood that silence, in moments like this, revealed more than questions ever could. And across the room Daniel signaled for the check with a small lift of his hand, the kind of gesture that suggested routine, as if this dinner had followed a script he had already rehearsed in his mind. Olivia leaned back slightly in her chair. Her posture relaxed, her expression composed, in a way that carried no trace of uncertainty, and that detail stayed with Margaret longer than anything else, because uncertainty would have made this easier to categorize, easier to dismiss as a mistake or a lapse in judgment, but there was none of that here. Only confidence, only control, only the quiet assurance of people who believed they were operating without interference. "What are you going to do?" Richard asked after a moment, his voice steady, measured, and Margaret let the question sit between them without answering right away, because doing something too quickly would mean reacting, and reacting would mean stepping into a situation that had already been designed without her in mind. She glanced briefly at Daniel again, watching the way he signed the receipt without looking at it for more than a second, the way he stood up and adjusted his jacket, slipping the folder securely inside as if it were something valuable, something necessary, something that had just moved one step closer to completion, and that was when Margaret understood that whatever this plan was, tonight had been a checkpoint, not an accident, not an improvisation, but a scheduled part of something larger. And that realization shifted her position entirely, because she was no longer just someone who had discovered something. She was now someone who had entered a timeline already in progress. "Nothing," she said finally, her voice calm, controlled. And Richard turned his head slightly, just enough to study her expression. "Nothing," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word, and Margaret nodded once, her gaze still forward. "Not yet," she added, and that distinction mattered, because doing nothing did not mean inaction. It meant observation, it meant timing, it meant allowing something to continue long enough to understand its full shape before stepping into it. Across the room Daniel placed a hand lightly at the small of Olivia's back as they began to walk toward the exit. The gesture subtle, but unmistakably familiar, and Margaret watched it without reacting, without even tightening her grip on the glass in front of her. Because reacting now would give him information he did not deserve to have. It would tell him where she stood, what she knew, how she felt, and she was not ready to give him any of that, not when he had already spent months, possibly longer, moving pieces without her awareness. "If you wait," Richard said quietly, "you might see more than you expect." Margaret let out a slow breath, not out of stress, but out of recognition, because she already understood that waiting was not a passive choice. It was a strategic one, and strategy required patience. "He thinks he is ahead," she said, more to herself than to Richard, and Richard gave a faint nod. "They always do," he replied, and for a brief moment, Margaret allowed herself to consider what that meant. Not just for Daniel, but for herself, because if he believed he was in control, if he believed the timing was his, then he would continue exactly as he had been, without adjusting, without hiding more carefully, without questioning whether anyone had seen what he assumed was invisible, and that was an advantage she could use. She reached for her phone again, turning it over in her hand, the message still there, still unread. Still part of the version of reality Daniel had chosen to present, and she left it that way, because acknowledging it now would serve no purpose, not when the truth was sitting 10 feet away from her, already confirmed, already unfolding. "I will need what you have," she said quietly after a moment, not looking at Richard, and he did not hesitate. "You will have it," he replied, just as calm, just as certain, because whatever this situation was, it had already connected them in a way neither of them had planned. Two observers stepping into the same moment from different directions, both arriving at the same conclusion, both understanding that what they had witnessed was only a fraction of something much larger. Margaret watched as the restaurant door closed behind Daniel and Olivia, the night air briefly visible through the glass before the space returned to its warm, controlled atmosphere. And she remained where she was, unmoving, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, because leaving immediately would make this feel like an ending, and she knew, with absolute clarity, that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of understanding, and somewhere outside, Daniel Hayes believed he had just completed another step in a plan no one else could see, but he was wrong, and that was going to matter very soon. Margaret did not leave the restaurant right away, even after the door had closed behind Daniel and Olivia, because leaving too quickly would feel like retreat, and she was not retreating, she was repositioning, and there was a difference. She sat still for another minute, then two, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as the server approached and asked if she needed anything else. She offered a small, polite smile and asked for the check, her voice even, her tone controlled. Nothing in her expression suggesting that anything unusual had happened at all, and that was intentional, because control, she had learned, was not about what you did in front of people, it was about what you chose not to reveal. The check arrived. She paid without hesitation, leaving a standard tip, nothing excessive, nothing memorable, because tonight was not a night she intended to be remembered for anything visible. She stood, smoothing the front of her coat, and for a brief moment her eyes moved toward the door, not with urgency, not with anger, but with quiet calculation, as if she were marking a point on a map rather than chasing a person. Outside, the air carried a mild chill, somewhere in the low 50s. The kind that made people pull their coats a little tighter, but did not rush them indoors. The parking lot lights cast a soft yellow glow across the pavement, and Margaret paused just long enough to take in the scene, not searching, not scanning frantically, just observing. Because observation was what had brought her this far already, and rushing now would only reduce the clarity she had gained. She spotted Daniel's car near the far row, a dark gray sedan she knew as well as her own reflection, but it remained parked, untouched, and that detail held her attention for a second longer than expected, because if he had left, he had not left alone. Or at least not in the way he usually did. She did not move toward it, did not check, did not confirm, because confirmation was no longer the goal. Understanding was. She walked instead toward her own car, her steps measured, her pace unhurried, unlocking the door with a quiet click that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness of the lot. Once inside, she did not start the engine immediately. She placed both hands lightly on the steering wheel and let the quiet settle around her, the faint hum of distant traffic, the occasional door closing somewhere across the lot, the soft ticking of her car as it adjusted to the cooler air, and in that stillness, she allowed herself to think, not emotionally, not reactively, but structurally, because everything she had seen, everything Richard had said, everything Daniel had done, it all pointed in the same direction. This was not a spontaneous betrayal, it was a coordinated movement, one that involved timing, documents, and a level of confidence that only came from preparation. She reached for her phone and turned it over again, the message still there, still unread, and she studied it for a moment before finally opening it, not because she needed to know what it said, but because she needed to understand how it fit into everything else. Working late, it read, followed by a brief, casual sign-off, and Margaret allowed herself a small exhale, not of relief, but of confirmation, because the simplicity of the message was exactly what made it effective. It was designed to be unremarkable, to blend into routine, to create a version of reality that required no further questions, and that meant Daniel had not just been lying, he had been maintaining a narrative, and narratives required consistency. Which meant this was not the first time he had sent a message like this, and it would not be the last, unless something interrupted it. She placed the phone down again, her gaze lifting to the windshield where the reflection of the parking lot lights blurred slightly against the glass, and for a moment she closed her eyes, not in exhaustion, not in distress, but in focus, because there was a decision forming, not about confrontation, not about emotion, but about timing. She would not call him, she would not text him. She would not give him any indication that tonight had changed anything at all, because from his perspective, nothing had. He would come home, or not. He would continue exactly as he had planned, and that was what she needed: consistency, predictability, the continuation of a pattern that she could now see clearly. She opened her eyes again and started the engine, the low vibration grounding her in the present moment, and as she pulled out of the parking space, she glanced once more toward the far row where Daniel's car remained, still unmoved, still waiting. And that image stayed with her as she drove out onto the main road, merging into light traffic that moved steadily under the streetlights, because somewhere ahead, Daniel believed he was still in control of the timeline, still moving forward without interference, still operating within a plan that belonged entirely to him. But Margaret knew something he did not, something simple, something quiet, something that would change everything when the time came. She was no longer behind him in that plan. She was watching it from the outside, and that meant she could choose exactly when to step in, and more importantly, exactly how. Margaret drove home without turning on the radio, the silence inside the car matching the clarity in her mind, because noise would only distract from what she had already begun to organize. And as the city lights passed steadily outside her window, she replayed the evening not as a series of emotional moments, but as a sequence of decisions: Daniel's message, the timing, the restaurant, the envelope, the folder, Richard's presence, each detail aligning into something structured, something intentional. And by the time she pulled into the driveway, she was no longer asking what had happened. She was asking why. The house greeted her the way it always did, quiet, orderly, unchanged, the porch light casting a soft glow across the entryway, the familiar creak of the front door as she stepped inside, and for a moment she paused just beyond the threshold, listening, not for anything specific, but out of habit, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant ticking of the wall clock, the subtle stillness of a place that had not yet been disturbed. She set her keys down on the console table with a soft, controlled motion, removing her coat and hanging it carefully, because routine mattered. Routine kept everything looking normal. And normal was exactly what she needed Daniel to believe still existed. She moved into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, the sound of it filling the glass steady and precise, and as she leaned lightly against the counter, she allowed her eyes to move across the space, the same space she had shared with Daniel for years, the same table where conversations had taken place, decisions had been made, plans had been built, and now, looking at it with the clarity she had gained, she could see the subtle shifts that had begun months ago, the late nights explained too simply, the financial discussions that had grown more vague, the way certain topics had been redirected or delayed, and none of it had felt urgent. At the time, none of it had demanded immediate attention, but now, in the quiet of the house, it all fit together too cleanly to ignore. She walked down the hallway toward his office, the door slightly ajar, just as he often left it, and she paused there for a second before stepping inside, not to search recklessly, not to disrupt anything, but to observe. The desk was neat, organized, as always, a laptop closed at the center, a few folders stacked to one side, nothing out of place, nothing obvious, and that was exactly what made it significant, because if Daniel had been careful enough to maintain appearances, then whatever mattered would not be left in plain sight. It would be stored, moved, or hidden within systems she had not yet seen. She did not touch anything, did not open drawers, did not move papers, because this was not the moment for action. This was the moment for understanding. She stepped back into the hallway and returned to the kitchen, placing her empty glass in the sink before picking up her phone again, her thumb hovering briefly before she opened her messages and typed a simple response. "Hope work is going well." She read it once, ensuring the tone was neutral, unchanged, then sent it without hesitation. Because consistency was not just something Daniel relied on. It was something she could use. If he believed she suspected nothing, he would continue without adjusting, and that was the advantage she intended to keep. A few minutes passed before the reply came. Short, casual, running late, will be home soon. And Margaret allowed herself the smallest acknowledgement of what that meant. He was maintaining the narrative, staying within the version of reality he had constructed, and that meant tonight had not disrupted his timeline at all, which was exactly what she needed. She set the phone down and moved into the living room, sitting on the couch with her posture relaxed, her expression calm, as if she were simply waiting for a normal evening to unfold. And when the sound of headlights swept briefly across the front window, followed by the quiet pull of a car into the driveway, she did not move immediately. She waited a few seconds, just enough to ensure her reaction matched expectation. Then she stood and walked toward the door, her steps even, controlled, and when it opened and Daniel stepped inside, loosening his tie, offering the same familiar expression he had worn countless times before, she met him with a small, composed smile, nothing forced, nothing exaggerated. Just enough to confirm what he already believed, that everything was exactly as it should be, and in that moment, as he set his keys down and began to speak about his evening, Margaret understood something with complete certainty. He had no idea that anything had changed, and that ignorance, that quiet, confident assumption, was going to be the most important part of everything that came next. Daniel moved through the house with the ease of someone who believed he was returning to something unchanged, setting his jacket over the back of a chair, loosening his tie as he spoke about delays, about meetings that ran longer than expected, about small inconveniences that sounded ordinary enough to require no further questions, and Margaret listened without interrupting, not because she believed him, but because she understood the value of letting someone complete the version of reality they had chosen to present. She nodded at the right moments, offered brief responses that neither confirmed nor challenged anything he said, and in doing so, she gave him exactly what he expected, a quiet, stable environment where his words did not need to be examined too closely. He moved into the kitchen and poured himself a drink, the familiar routine continuing as if nothing had shifted, and Margaret watched the details now, the timing of his movements, the slight pause before certain answers, the way his phone remained within reach on the counter. Screen facing down, not hidden, but not entirely exposed either. It was careful, but not careful enough, and that distinction mattered, because people who believed they were safe often overlooked the small adjustments that revealed more than they intended. "Did you eat?" he asked casually, glancing toward her, and Margaret nodded once. "I had something earlier," she said, her tone even, controlled, and Daniel accepted that without question, because he was not looking for inconsistencies. He was maintaining continuity, and that was exactly what she needed him to do. He took a sip from his glass and leaned lightly against the counter, continuing to speak about work, about a potential deal, about documents that needed to be finalized, and Margaret noted that word, documents, not because it was unusual, but because of how it fit into what she had already seen, the envelope, the folder, the exchange that had not been emotional but procedural. And she filed that away without reacting, because acknowledging it too soon would disrupt the pattern she needed to observe. "It might take a few more late nights this week," he added, almost as an afterthought, and Margaret gave a small, understanding nod. "That is fine," she said, and the simplicity of her response reinforced exactly what he expected, that she trusted him, that she accepted the explanation, that there was no reason to adjust his behavior, and for a brief moment, something in his posture relaxed further. Just slightly, just enough to confirm that her response had removed any potential tension he might have anticipated, and that small shift told her more than any explanation could, because it confirmed that he had considered the possibility of resistance, of questions, of doubt, and had prepared for it, but now that it had not appeared, he could continue without modification. They moved into the living room together, the television turning on to fill the space with low background noise. Neither of them fully watching, both maintaining the appearance of a normal evening, and Margaret allowed the silence between his words to stretch naturally. not forcing conversation, not seeking clarification, because the absence of pressure kept everything in place. After a while, Daniel checked his phone. A quick glance, a brief pause, then he set it back down without comment. But Margaret noticed the timing, the subtle awareness of incoming information, and she did not look at the screen. Did not ask, because not knowing in that moment was more valuable than confirming too early. Eventually, he stood and excused himself, mentioning a few emails he needed to send before the night ended, and Margaret watched as he walked down the hallway toward his office, closing the door with a soft, controlled motion, and she remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, because this was the moment that mattered, not what he said, not what he had done earlier, but what he did when he believed he was alone. She reached for her phone slowly, scrolling through her recent messages until she found Richard's number, which he had given her before they left the restaurant, and after a brief pause, she sent a single message, "I am ready to see what you have." The response came quickly, as if he had been expecting it, "Tomorrow morning," and Margaret set the phone down again, her gaze lifting toward the hallway where the office door remained closed. A barrier that now represented more than just a room, because behind it, Daniel was continuing whatever process he had set in motion, confident, uninterrupted, unaware, and Margaret understood that tonight had not been about confrontation. It had been about confirmation, and now that she had it, the next steps would not be reactive, they would be deliberate, because for the first time since this had begun, she was no longer trying to understand what was happening. She was beginning to decide what to do about it, and Daniel, sitting just a few feet away behind that closed door, had no idea that the balance had already started to shift. The next morning arrived without announcement, the kind of quiet, pale light filtering through the windows that made everything look unchanged, and Margaret moved through the house with the same steady rhythm she had always kept, preparing coffee, setting a cup on the counter, maintaining a routine that felt so ordinary it would have been impossible for anyone watching to suspect that anything had shifted beneath it. Daniel was already up, dressed, moving through his own version of the morning with practiced efficiency, checking his phone between sips of coffee, scanning emails, his attention divided but controlled, and Margaret watched him without appearing to watch, noting the timing again. The way he responded quickly to some messages and ignored others, the slight pause when a particular notification appeared before he turned the screen away, not abruptly, not defensively, just enough to keep it out of casual view. "I might be out most of the day," he said, glancing at her briefly, and Margaret nodded. "I have a few things to take care of as well," she replied, her tone neutral, her expression composed, and he accepted that without question, because there was nothing in her voice to suggest anything beyond routine. And that was the point, to remain within the version of reality he believed still existed. He finished his coffee, grabbed his keys, and left with the same casual goodbye he had given countless times before, the door closing softly behind him, and Margaret waited, not moving immediately, not rushing to act, because timing mattered. She counted the seconds in silence, listening as the sound of his car faded down the street, ensuring he was far enough away, ensuring there would be no interruption, and only then did she move, not hurried, not tense, just deliberate. She picked up her phone and checked the message from Richard again. "Tomorrow morning," it had said, and now it was morning. She gathered her things, her coat, her bag, everything in place, everything controlled, and stepped out into the same calm air that had greeted her the night before. The temperature slightly cooler now, the kind of crispness that sharpened focus rather than distracting from it. The drive was quiet, the roads not yet fully crowded, giving her space to think, not emotionally, but structurally, reviewing what she knew, what she had seen, what she still needed, and by the time she pulled into the parking lot of the small office building Richard had mentioned, she was no longer uncertain about anything except the details she had yet to confirm. The building itself was unremarkable, 2 stories, neutral colors, the kind of place that did not attract attention, which made it ideal for the kind of work Richard had described. She parked, stepped out and walked inside with a calm, steady pace, the hallway quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and when she reached the door with Richard's name on it, she paused only briefly before knocking once, controlled, measured, and the door opened almost immediately, as if he had been expecting her at that exact moment, which he likely had, right on time, he said, stepping aside to let her in. The office was simple, organized, a desk, 2 chairs, a file cabinet, nothing unnecessary, everything intentional, and that detail aligned perfectly with what she had already understood about him. He closed the door behind her and moved toward the desk, where a folder rested at the center, thicker than the one she had seen the night before, and for a second, Margaret's attention settled on it, not with urgency, not with anxiety, but with recognition, because this was the next step, not a confrontation, not a reaction, but an expansion of understanding. "Everything I have is in here," Richard said, placing his hand lightly on the folder, not opening it yet, as if acknowledging the weight of what it contained. Timelines, transfers, communications, nothing illegal on the surface, but enough to show intent. Margaret stepped closer, her gaze steady, her posture composed. And she did not reach for the folder immediately, because she understood that once she did, there would be no returning to the version of events she had lived in before, and that mattered, not because she wanted to go back, but because she recognized the significance of crossing that point. "Before I look," she said quietly, "I need to know one thing." Richard nodded once, waiting. "Do they think they are close to finishing whatever this is?" she asked, and Richard held her gaze for a brief moment before answering. "Yes," he said simply. And Margaret absorbed that without visible reaction, because that confirmed everything she needed to know about timing, about urgency, about how carefully she would need to move next. She reached forward then, finally placing her hand on the folder, feeling the weight of it under her fingers, and in that moment, something shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, because this was no longer about suspicion or observation, it was about evidence. And evidence changed everything. She opened the folder slowly, her eyes scanning the first page, taking in the names, the dates, the structure of what had been unfolding behind her back, and as the details began to connect in ways that removed any remaining doubt, Margaret understood one final thing with absolute clarity. Daniel had believed he was building something without her knowledge, but what he had actually done was create a record, and now, she was the one reading it. Margaret did not rush as she turned the first page, her eyes moving steadily across the document, taking in each line not as isolated information, but as part of a larger structure that was now unfolding in front of her with quiet precision. Dates aligned in sequence, transactions recorded with exact amounts, meeting locations listed in a pattern that matched what Richard had described, and names appearing more than once: Daniel Hayes, Olivia Carter, and then others, attorneys, consultants. Entities that at first glance looked legitimate, but when placed together formed something far more deliberate, something coordinated. She flipped to the next page, then the next, her expression unchanged, her posture still. Because reacting would not change what was already there, and what was there was clear. Daniel had not just been planning to leave. He had been preparing to restructure everything around him: assets, accounts, ownership, all positioned in a way that would allow him to move forward without disruption, without loss, without her, and that realization settled into her mind not as a shock, but as confirmation of what she had already begun to understand. Across the desk, Richard remained silent, allowing her the space to process without interruption. Because this was not information that needed explanation, it needed recognition. Margaret paused briefly on a page that outlined a timeline, key dates marked with small notes beside them. And one of those dates stood out. Immediately, 3 days from now, a scheduled filing, a transfer, something that appeared routine on paper but carried weight when viewed in context. "This is when it completes," she said quietly, not looking up, and Richard nodded once. "That is what it looks like," he replied, his voice calm, and Margaret continued reading. noting how each step led to that point, how nothing had been left to chance, how every movement had been calculated to ensure a clean transition, and for a moment, she allowed herself to consider how easily she could have missed all of this, how easily she could have remained in the version of reality Daniel had constructed, unaware until it was too late to respond effectively, and that thought did not bring anger, it brought clarity, because clarity was what allowed her to act without hesitation. She closed the folder slowly, placing her hand on top of it for a second as if marking the end of one phase and the beginning of another. Then she looked at Richard, her gaze steady, composed. "He thinks this is already decided," she said, and Richard gave a slight nod. "He is acting like it is," he replied, and Margaret allowed a small pause before speaking again, not to gather courage, but to finalize direction. "Then we do not interrupt it," she said, her tone calm, controlled, and Richard studied her for a brief moment, as if measuring the meaning behind those words. "You want him to continue," he said, and Margaret nodded once. "Yes," she replied, "because if he continues, he completes the pattern, and when a pattern is complete, it is easier to prove." She reached for the folder again, opening it to the page with the upcoming date, her finger resting lightly beside it. "We let him reach this point," she said, "but we are there before he realizes anything has changed." Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, considering, then gave a small nod of agreement. Because what she was describing was not reaction, it was timing, it was positioning, it was allowing someone to believe they were in control until the moment that control could be removed without warning. Margaret closed the folder again and stood, her movements smooth, unhurried, because urgency was no longer necessary. She knew what she needed to know, and more importantly, she knew when she needed to act. "I will need copies," she said, and Richard was already moving to gather them, prepared, efficient, handing them over without unnecessary conversation, because both of them understood the importance of what was happening. Margaret took the documents and placed them carefully into her bag, ensuring everything remained organized, because disorder would only create confusion later, and confusion was not something she could afford. "He has no idea," Richard said quietly, almost as a statement rather than a question, and Margaret met his gaze for a brief moment. "No," she said simply. And that single word carried everything it needed to, because Daniel Hayes, at that exact moment, was moving through his day believing he was 3 steps ahead, believing his plan was intact, believing that the version of reality he had constructed was still holding, and that belief was the most important part of everything that would follow. Margaret turned toward the door, pausing only long enough to ensure she had everything she needed, then stepped out into the hallway, the same quiet hum of the building surrounding her, unchanged, controlled, and as she walked toward the exit, she felt no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a clear, steady understanding of what came next, not confrontation, not emotion, but execution, because 3 days from now, Daniel expected everything to fall into place exactly as he had planned, and Margaret intended to be there when it did. Not as someone reacting to the outcome, but as the one who had already rewritten it without him knowing, and that difference, that quiet shift in control, was going to be the moment he finally understood something he had overlooked from the very beginning. He had never been as far ahead as he believed.